Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Driving the Business of Science podcast. My name is Keith Parent, and I'm the CEO of Court Square Group. We are a managed service firm. We manage IT infrastructure for life science clients, pharmaceutical, biotech, med device. We do a lot of work with clinical and regulatory departments in companies, particularly anything that's highly regulated. We have a system called ARC. It's an audit-ready compliant cloud environment, and we can host and manage any application from preclinical through manufacturing. In that role, we actually see a lot of different people, and one of those people is Jim Kernan, who we're going to talk to today. We also have a system called RegDocs 365, which is a content repository, and we are working with Jim on some things using RegDocs. So I thought it was good for Jim to talk about his role, what he does, what they do. The topic for today is going to be de-risking the early stage clinical trial supply chain. And with that, I'd like to introduce Jim Kernan. Jim.
Thank you very much, Keith, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. And you undersold how much support you give us with RegDocs, so we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through some of the conversation today, I'm sure. So my background is clinical trial operations with a particular focus on early phase clinical supply across the globe and across the Atlantic. We have clients primarily in the US and in Europe, who we serve across the globe. My own personal background, very briefly, is 40 years in the pharmaceutical game, with the last 20 years or so being on the clinical side. We have a number of contract service supply companies in that specific area. And I think today, Keith, we probably talk a little bit more about the clinical supply piece and the management of data and some other aspects of that business.
That's fantastic. And as I said earlier, the podcast is called Driving the Business of Science. And a lot of times what I want to do is talk to people who are dealing with lots of the areas outside of the actual science of it, because there's so many things that people don't realize that we have to deal with in the life science world. Everybody talks about, we're an IT firm and we deal with IT, but there's lots of great IT firms out there, but there's very few of them that actually understand all the complexities of life science and what has to happen there. One of the things that we want to talk about, Jim, today was managing the complexities of that clinical trial supply chain data flow and how that works. Can you just kind of elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure, with pleasure. I think maybe to help set the scene for that a little bit, there has been a change, as we all know, in the industry over the last 20 years, effectively, in that movement, that very solid movement from the small molecule world produced by chemical synthesis through to the biotech world, with all the biology, etc., involved in that. One of the characteristics of that change has been a change in the nature of the supply chain. So the supply chain in the old days, and to some extent still today, but primarily in the old days, was a very simple, very linear process with relatively few points along the line. So you had the API manufacturer, and then you had a formulation, fill and finish, and indeed oftentimes packaging facility, and then you distribute it to the market. Oftentimes the testing was done in that final stage facility as well. So very linear supply chain with relatively few nodes. Now, it's worth contrasting that with the world of the biotech industry, where it's multi-nodal, often widely geographically dispersed, with lots of parts of the process being done in lots of different locations, both geographically and in terms of time zone. One client we have, for example, today has 10 nodes in their supply chain for one simple IMP, investigational medicinal product. So this explosion, this expansion of the supply chain has by its nature amplified considerably the amount of data that's been generated in the supply chain from the manufacturers of the various plasmids, the vectors, maybe it's LNP or it could be a viral vector, through to multiple different test sites doing different types of very specific testing on the product for their clients. Somehow or another, we have to bring all that data together in a secure and a logical fashion, because it has to be reviewed in order to release the product, as we all know, and batch certify the material to go to the clinical trial. So that increasing complexity has presented its own challenges. It can cause a simple discoordination between various activities, but it can also cause a lot of inefficiency in terms of batch release. And when we have patients in clinical trial spaces depending on us to deliver material very quickly and on time and safely, getting a hold of that data so that it can be properly reviewed, properly looked at in near real time as it emerges is vitally important. So that's where the complexity now has increased hugely in the data flows that runs parallel to the actual product flow itself.
Well, it's interesting, Jim. And Jim and I actually got to meet many years ago, probably about 5 or 6 years ago now, Jim, out in Palm Springs. We were at a conference together and we were talking about some of the work that we're doing. And I was fascinated by what you guys do. And if you can't tell, Jim is not native to the US. Jim's over in Ireland right now and doing a lot of work with EU-based companies. And it was fascinating to me to find out some of the new things that I didn't even know about the clinical supply chain and what happens out there. And we can talk a little bit about that. One of the things that we talked about is the QP, and I didn't know what a QP was back when we first met. And Jim's like, "Well, do you understand the QP?" And I'm like, "Yeah, everybody's qualified, aren't they?" And it's like, well, the concept of a qualified person is, and I'm very specific to some of what we're talking about. Can we just talk about that role of the
Sure,
qualified person?
and I don't blame you, Keith, for being confused as to what I mean. What is a qualified person? Have you been to college? Yeah, but it's actually something more than that in the context of our industry. And sometimes I think that the French version of the same thing explains it a bit more clearly. The French version is pharmacien responsable, the responsible pharmacist. So essentially, what the role of this qualifier, you don't have this person in the US in terms of batch certification. Their role is well, they have two roles: batch certification and GMP certification of the supply chain compliance to European regulations. That's the two facets of a QP's role. And under the batch certification piece, of course, we talked about all that data a moment ago. The QP and their team have to review every single aspect of that multi-layered onion of data around a product. So they're looking at that data from the point of view of its GMP compliance, its compliance with the IND or the IMPD in Europe, its compliance with the marketing authorization if it's a finished product, its compliance with a clinical trial application or protocol if that's the case. So it's cross-checking that everything that was supposed to have been done under the approved batch records and in accordance with artwork specifications and you name it, has been done correctly. And they're also looking at the traceability of everything in that supply chain to ensure that there's no hidden gaps as to where a raw material may have come from, or indeed how a batch may have been subdivided into multiple different languages and often indeed different presentations. So management of data is a key part of this whole clinical supply operation that we're involved in. I often describe to people, I say to them that, about 20% of what we physically do as an early phase supply chain partner is physical. It's putting a label on a vial, or it's putting a label on a carton, put the two together, shipping it maybe to some clinical site in the south of France or the south of Africa, or somewhere in South America or in the US. The other 80% of what we do, though, is actually managing that data. That's where we spend most of our hours as a team of people, really checking that all of the data is correct. And as I mentioned a moment ago, that actually begins before we produce anything. The QP, the qualified person, has a responsibility to review audit reports from every element of the manufacturing supply chain and the test labs to confirm that they are compliant with EU GMP if you wish to supply in the European Union. Or indeed, it's the same rules apply in Australia. They follow the same guidelines. So it's a fairly onerous task. And, it is the qualified person is the person who is legally responsible. And if they don't do their job properly, they have a lot of legal liability. I remember seeing a cartoon one time of a QP in a pair of handcuffs because they didn't bring the right colored pen to work one day. But it's a joke, but nevertheless, it's kind of real. They have to take their job very seriously.
That's amazing. When you think about that, what's the type of certification that the QP has to get? Is it different for each country that they have, or is it one for the EU in general? How does that work?
Um, At the top level, it's for the EU in general, but when they make the statement, the sheet of paper that they issue is actually called a certificate of conformance. It's no different in many ways to what you would use in the US. But at the bottom of that sheet of paper, there's a very specific reference to state that the product has been manufactured in compliance with the relevant IMPD or IND, Investigational Medicinal Product dossier, and the European regulations. Now, those regulations are also supplemented by what might be applicable in any given particular clinical trial approval document. So it's a combination of the clinical trial approval document, the general European GMP regulations, and the specifics, the particulars, the registered particulars in the IMPD or in the US, the IND. And indeed, one final comment on that, oftentimes clinical trial materials are supplied out of Europe to other markets around the world. And even though it's not being used in the European Union, if it has been manufactured in the European Union, it's preferred that a qualified person would review that batch before it's released. One last little point that sometimes people are surprised at about qualified persons' role is that in the European environment, there's a two-stage release of a product to a patient or to a person in a trial. The first stage is that our QP, the qualified person, says it's been made correctly. But that's step one of a step two process. There's a second step, which is where the sponsor of the trial and or their representative physician, principal investigator, makes a decision that not only has this material been made correctly, but it is also actually suitable for this particular patient in that particular set of circumstances. There's quite a few belts and braces, slightly different maybe to what happens in some other parts of the world. The quality team typically releases a batch in the US without reference to a qualified person.
It's interesting. When I first met you, Jim, one of the things that you explained to me was the name of the company, PRONAV Clinical. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you guys help to navigate the EU complexities? Because there are so many complexities in the EU.
Yeah, this is true. I guess the way we do it, and this links back to the complexity of the data that we were talking about a moment ago. Many times for emerging companies, emerging biotech, emerging pharma companies that are perhaps facing a clinical supply challenge for the first time, they've probably spent, 10, 15 years creating their molecule. They could tell you every single nuance, every detail of that particular molecule. But they're sometimes suddenly faced with a challenge by their venture fund, be it backers or whomever. You need to start your clinical trial in Europe now. And by the way, there's 6 languages involved and 10 different presentations. How does that person begin to grab a hold of that nettle and think about, temperature control logistics, a site of importation, finding a qualified person, shipping the material in, recording the temperatures that they were shipped. All of that body of work can be daunting. So that's actually where the navigate part of PRONAV came from, was we sort of work with folks to help them navigate that challenge and sort of educate them gently to things that they might know. But of course, when you're navigating somewhere, the thing you need is a map. And as a result of that, we generated, and with RegDocs 365 help, a very simple template that has almost become standardized that we introduce to every single client that we meet. And the template allows us from a single portal to frame in the mind of the sponsor all of the tasks they have to do over time, not necessarily all immediately, but at least they get the picture of the pathway to material delivery to their sites in Europe and all the things they need to get in place to do that. So we have that list of jobs, the tasks, and to each task then we can associate the particular document that goes with that. So that might be, for example, an audit report of a test laboratory, or it could be an executed batch record, or it might be a piece of master artwork that has to be approved. Whatever the particular task is required. And that sits on the same platform in the cloud along with the actual task itself. And then on top of that, we use a simple set of traffic lights to indicate to the team where we're at in each of those tasks. So simple red, green, and yellow, and blue occasionally. We do have a blue in there as well for a particular status. And again, with the beauty of the particular solution we have is that it allows us to communicate directly from within the system. You're not going out to an email and coming back to it again. And all of this in turn sits on our 21 CFR Part 11 and EU Annex 11 service provided by Court Square in Massachusetts, in Springfield. And I can tell you without fear of faith that fear of contradiction, that 4.5 years down the road, every single one of our clients absolutely love it. They wouldn't work without it. It has become the agenda setter and the record keeper for every project meeting that we have. And it has worked very, very well.
Well, I think it's interesting, Jim. I think it's interesting when you talk about the amount of data that's generated, keeping track of it, making sure we've got the 21 CFR Part 11 capabilities of the audit logging and everything else that we do together in that ProMap application. So I think that's a fantastic thing. One of the things that you mentioned a little bit earlier was, that role of the early clinical supply chain and how it's changed and morphed over time, with not only going from small molecule, but then going to the biologics and even now to some of the personalized medicine and some of the autologous or allogeneic stem cell, and how that's changed some of that early supply chain. One of the things that we talked about, you mentioned a little bit earlier, was the whole concept of temperature capabilities and things like that. Yeah. Talk to us a little bit about how that's changed and really the science of that minus 80 degree storage and distribution. How do they get it right? We really started to hear about that a lot of when the viruses came out and COVID came out and people were looking at different storage capabilities. Can you talk a little bit about that and why does it have to be so cold?
Well, to be so cold is to keep it preserved, so we retain the stability. So that's fairly straightforward. I mean, it has to be cold to keep a biological life form stable over time. Now, does it need to be minus 80 or minus 20 or even 228? But it is maybe an open question. And to be fair, I think initially people have erred very much on the side of caution. Minus 80, it's safe, and that's fine. I've noticed recently that some people are relaxing for certain products, minus 80 back up to minus 20, as they have more data, more stability data coming to them. There's, of course, at the other extreme that I won't mention here today is the cryogenic, the liquid nitrogen side, but that's another whole ball game again. But just in that space of the transfer of vaccines around the world at minus 80, it was absolutely vital we did that at the time. And that has presented its own challenges. The amount of dry ice that's been shipped around the world now is an awful lot more than it was even 10 years ago in terms of pharmaceutical products. And dry ice in itself can present its own challenges. We use a lot of it here, shipping across the globe. I think right now we've just shipped to 16 sites in the US this morning on dry ice. And that has been a learning curve for us. We've learned a lot about the subtleties of dry ice. Everybody thinks about dry ice as minus 78.5 degrees C, sitting on the floor, smoking away, and keeping the temperature low. And that's true if you don't do anything with it. If you leave it sit there and you keep it nicely, I won't say sealed. You can't seal dry ice containers, but at least enclosed, enveloped. And I'll explain. There's a subtlety in that. I'll explain in a minute. When you're using dry ice for any application in terms of transportation, there are two factors that's extremely important to keep in place. And to preface that, keep in mind that most people will have validated their sterile vial with its plastic stopper and its lid at sort of between minus 90 and minus 70. That's typically what you've got. So that's where you have to keep it. So you say to yourself, yeah, minus 78.5, dry ice, 1 atmosphere is great. But the sublimation temperature of dry ice will change. In fact, it will drop, surprisingly, if you do two things. One, if you lower the pressure. And two, if you don't retain a volume of carbon dioxide gas around the dry ice. If you reduce the concentration of carbon dioxide gas, the partial pressure of the carbon dioxide drops, and the sublimation will start to accelerate and drop the temperature of the dry ice. It literally pulls more heat out of the out of the dry ice. If you drop the pressure, again, the sublimation will happen more quickly and again pull the dry ice. Now, either of these things by themselves wouldn't be a major problem. You know, you lose a couple of degrees. For example, if you drop the pressure of the atmosphere around dry ice, say from 14.7 psi for a normal atmosphere, down to say 10 psi, you'll move straight away from minus 78.5 to minus 83.2. Straight away, you've dropped about 5 degrees there, simply by dropping the air pressure by 4.7 degrees. Not a disaster in its own right. Most airlines travel at around 10 to 11 psi, so not a major risk in its own right, okay? But on the other hand, if you don't have the package well enveloped so that you maintain a CO2 gas space around the dry ice inside the cardboard box, you're losing partial pressure, and again, you're going to get another significant drop in temperature. Put the two together, and we've actually experienced this ourselves on several occasions in the last year, you're going to find yourself with the product for a period of time at less than minus 90, which really sounds slightly counterintuitive that dry ice should do that, but it's the combination of reduction in pressure and reduction in partial pressure of the CO2 can cause that. One of our clients are concerned about that because they have a view, I don't have data to support it myself, but it's their view and it's their product, that the rubber stopper in the vial, when it goes below minus 90, has a potential to shrink and slightly crack, therefore potentially compromising the sterility of the product. So we have to watch that very, very carefully. So that's just an example of the kind of challenges that come with some of this increased use of cold chain temperature management during the transportation and distribution supply chain.
Well, you know, it's funny because when people talk about how expensive drugs are and you know what the cost is and everything, people don't realize how much goes into things like the dry ice, things like the transportation of those kind of things. Even the labels that we have to put on those, when you think about that temperature, you know,
Yeah.
things seem to fall off. You know, you have to deal with all of the vagaries of different temperatures like that so that it actually maintains what you need to maintain. And
Yeah.
you can, and again, it's traceability. When you talk about data, there's a label on that. If that label falls off, let's say you have a box of things and the labels fall off, which vial is which, right? I mean, that's the kind of thing that you gotta
Absolutely
worry about.
right. Yeah, and that very point you've just raised actually created a huge challenge for the smaller volume minus 80 products. When we made COVID vaccines, they were pre-labeled vials, and you filled them and you froze them down. But if you're a clinical trial manufacturer and your total world supply is maybe 1,000 vials that has to be distributed across 10 or 15 clinical trial sites across the world in different languages, you can't afford to pre-label them. So as a consequence, you then have to be able to label after they've been frozen down to minus 80. I wasn't expecting that question from you, but just to let you know, we've just completed validation 2 months ago for a Swiss client, the validation of a minus 80 labeling process, label design and process, which allows labeling post freeze down of blank vials filled with their product. It took some very special work with the glue on those labels to actually get to the point where we could do that with a multiple wraparound label using a train track solution. So that's actually one of our pride and joys from last year.
You know, and to be honest with you, that is when you talk about the business of science, there are things that scientists don't ever think about because that's not something that they're worried about. Like you said, they're worried about their molecule, they're worried about everything else. You guys have to think about everything else that they don't think about, right? And those are the kind of things that are out there. Well, Jim, I thank you very much. This has been really enlightening. I think there's some fantastic things that we can talk about. I'd love to have you back again at some point and talk some more about that supply chain. I know that you're involved right now in a consortium down in Maryland. I think that's going to be a topic. Maybe we can have a future podcast. Which we you want to give us 2 seconds on that before we close? I'd love to have it, and we'll say goodbye.
Yeah, I just 2 quick seconds. Thank you, Keith. Just 2 quick seconds on that. We're working with a group of allied collaborative companies who all do bits of the same stuff that we do, but just in different places. And to bring the knowledge that's inherent within those 4 or 5 companies to the marketplace and to emerging biotech and pharmatech companies, we're putting together a thing called Clinical Bridge. And Clinical Bridge is a forum in which we will just share the kind of stories I've shared with you today across all of our companies in a video format to be shared at fora, online, at conferences, and on demand as our clients may want them. And it's really about sharing knowledge, sharing our experiences, and providing some maybe little signposts to folks who may not know how to navigate some of the challenges we've faced over the last several years. So that's it. That's what Clinical Bridge is. I'd love to talk to you a bit more about that as we go forward. And in the meantime, just to say many thanks for the opportunity to have a chat with you. It's been a good collaboration so far, and I look forward to more of it in the future. Thank you very much, Keith.
Jim, it's been a wonderful experience today, and I hope that all of our listeners will get a lot out of this today. You're always a fountain of knowledge every time I talk with you, and hopefully I'll get to see you back here in the States at some point shortly. Have a great day. Thanks, everybody. And this has been the Driving the Business of Science podcast. Everybody have a great day. Thank you all.